So your bio has informed everyone that you have gone to the bar in 1996. You do work in areas of insurance, personal injury, commercial and administrative law. You work into district, supreme and high courts. But with your other role, you've been able to appear as a barrister and otherwise in complex and lengthy inquiries as a counsel assisting. Further discussion in your bio is about how your common law practice means that you've acted for both plaintiffs and defendants in commercial disputes and claims, cases involving victims of institutional abuse. There's someone that possibly needs to mute there. That's the background that we have that we're going to explore a little bit in some questions now. Firstly, can you tell us a little bit about your education and your career journey into your current role as a barrister?
Sure. So, grew up in Sydney, went to not one of the flash schools, but Sydney Uni, arts law, then worked as a solicitor for 3 or 4 years or so in Sydney, then a short stint in London, then travelled for a while when I was young, carefree, and then came back to work as a solicitor in Sydney. And then in 96, felt I'd give the bar a go. So sat the bar exams and passed and began practicing as a barrister in 96 and have continued in private practice ever since. As you pointed out, predominantly in the area of common law, insurance, commercial matters, so fires, accidents, injuries, and in terms of injuries, that includes a lot of abuse cases. So I act in those mostly for the victims. Still got quite a few of those in which I've got a whole briefs, and some coronial work, as I think I've put in my CV over the years, mostly paid for by insurers, so acting on behalf of councils, but the instructions come from the insurers, mostly because they're concerned about potential common law action following on from the incident in question, either from in respect of the deceased or family members. And then, and some criminal work, but only small amounts. I know I've gone from answering a question directly, which was about education, but I thought I would come up to that point. And
that's great. Yeah, and also from your CV, you've had roles as counsel assisting in various inquiries. That work is different, isn't it, to accepting a brief as a barrister or working as a solicitor for either plaintiff or defendant in a civil matter, for example. Do you like to explain a little bit about the role of the counsel assisting?
Yes. So the ones I've appeared in are, I think, almost exclusively military matters, but the role is essentially the same. And it's different in different jurisdictions as to precisely what the role is. In the civil jurisdiction, which is not one that I'm, the civil inquiry jurisdiction, in which I only have fleeting involvement, counsel assisting is usually an independent role, in a sense that it's a statutorily independent role from, say, for example, the ICAC commissioner. He or her is a statutory appointment. So the counsel assisting is meant to be independent. But the reality is counsel assisting in most inquiries will work very closely with the tribunal. For example, before a counsel assisting will give his or her opening address, it will almost certainly have been vetted by the tribunal. For example, in ICAC, often the media go into a frenzy when counsel assisting give their opening address, and he or her is standing up in front of the tribunal, outlining what's going to happen or what they foreshadow will happen through the evidence. But it's not, and it's presented as if it's all news and all new information to the tribunal, but it's almost certain that the tribunal has gone through it in fine detail, vetted that opening speech. And it's one, as someone's once described it as like counsel assisting like the hand in the glove, or at least the other way around. So it's perhaps I'm not explaining it very well, but counsel assisting essentially presents the evidence, but does so in a way that the tribunal is anticipating and wants. One final example I'll give is in an adjournment, it would not be uncommon for counsel assisting to go and have morning tea with the tribunal and discuss the way the evidence is unfolding. And the tribunal may say, look, I want you to focus on this, or I want you to ask about this, and may even indeed virtually draft the questions for counsel assisting. So there's some aspect of theatre to it all, as opposed to pure unfolding of evidence.
And thank you. If you were to compare the work that have done and do for plaintiffs versus defendants, there's a different orientation to both of those roles as well, I'd imagine, or similarities as well as differences between those roles.
Oh, definitely. I mean, the work for defendants and insurers, much more commercial orientated. Insurers just are looking at the bottom line. Occasionally they'll take the moral high ground, but usually they just want to get out of the case as cheaply as possible. Acting for plaintiffs, it's a completely different dynamic. That he or her, the person for whom you're acting, yes, they want to maximize their outcome, but they're not watching you like a hawk. Whereas an insurer, well, they'll be judging your performance and critiquing it in a very professional way. That usually in a personal injury matter for a plaintiff, all they care about is how much they're going to get at the end of the day. And that sounds like it's a transactional matter, and it is, but it needs to be understood against the background of there are many occasions these people, it's their whole life is depending on the outcome of the court case, particularly if they've been badly injured. But I'll give one example. I acted for a lady just recently who lost her leg in a motorcycle accident, and she was a nurse, and it wasn't happening on the way to work or anything like that. So it wasn't as if she could claim workers' comp, and she didn't have any insurance other than the ability to sue the person who turned in front of her and into whom she collided. So, her whole life depended on the outcome of that case. And we got what I think is a great result, and we're able to set her up. So yeah, different dynamic acting for plaintiffs as opposed to defendant insurance companies or government.
Yeah, thank you. And look, another aspect of the work that you've done for the New South Wales Bar Association has been the professional conduct committee work at times. That's a part of work for the Bar Association that our students, of course, learn in ethics subjects with us. Would you like to reflect a bit on that work and the importance of that work?
For me, the great thing about the bar, and indeed the legal profession more broadly, is the ethical side of the work. We like to think it's a noble profession, in that people act honestly and interact honest, and so much so that when you're in court, if someone says something, one assumes that it's based on a correct understanding of the evidence, or is based on instructions, or if someone makes a submission in the same way, you're assuming that it's, particularly if they make a submission about the law, that they've researched it and that their summary of a case or an authority is accurate. And we rely on people's ethical behaviour as opposed to having to stop and cross-check everything people say. Similarly, in a negotiation, which many cases resolved by way of settlement, mediation, and so on. And lawyers are meant to act honestly in negotiations. And for example, if someone says, I offer you $100,000 and they say that's the maximum amount my clients will give me, we like to be able to think we can take people on their word and that's the truth. But occasionally people will fudge it and they will be less than frank with the truth, or they'll make a submission to court that is inaccurate. And that's why one needs to have these professional conduct committees. Thankfully, I think they're not used that often, but people are held up for these, breaches of these rules. And so I think it's very important.
Thanks for those reflections. Finally, just some questions about law in the media, and you can end with some tips and wisdom about law student experience as well. But maybe thinking about this question in terms of when you were a student and now, and your substantive presentation will touch on some of these things perhaps, but what's the importance of lawyers or academics presenting law accessibly in the media for the general public and also for those who are legally trained in the media?
I'm not quite sure if I've got your question down pat, but let me have a crack at it. Correct me if I'm not answering you responsively. And I might do it by way of illustration. Over the last few years, there seems to have been a series of cases where legal developments in the case is driven partly by media responses. And the ones that jump out at me is Kathleen Folbig, who's the lady who was convicted of murdering 4 of her children. And that has gone through a series of appeals and then different commissions of inquiry. I think at the moment I don't think it's a royal commission, but some form of inquiry being conducted by Tom Bathurst, the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of New South Wales. And that's, I think, the 3rd inquiry to that case. And that's almost certainly been driven by media interest, which in fact been driven by a number of interest groups centered around some universities. And I think one in particular at Newcastle University. And I don't say this critically, but they have essentially formed groups of volunteer law students and lawyers to review evidence and put in submissions. And they've partly harnessed the media, as I understand it, to push for those types of inquiries. So I'm just going to give a series of examples and then come back to try and answer your question more specifically. Another one example of that, one might say, is the recent situation in respect of Bruce Lehrman in the ACT, and the way that his trial has now, was in the end aborted due to jury misconduct. But then there has spun out of that a series of at least 2 inquiries, one at the moment being conducted by the former Solicitor General of Queensland, whose name's eluding me at the moment. It'll come to me in a moment. Walter Sofronoff QC, who's actually a Navy reservist lawyer, not the one Glenn referred to earlier. And there's another inquiry into the manner with which the AFP may or may not have leaked information. So my point is, I think one can say fairly confidently that some of those, at least one, if not both of those inquiries, are partly informed by the media attention the trial has got. One might say, but I'd be interested to hear a different view, but certainly that the intense focus of the media, it's been, particularly News Limited, have given it they've taken a certain view about it. Some of their columnists, 9 newspapers on the other hand seem to take a slightly different view. So you've almost got people taking sides in the media, and it just seems to drive these inquiries. Perhaps I'll give one final example, and it's almost to the contrary of what I'm saying, but the matter with Christian Porter, the former Attorney General, about a year, 18 months ago, and there were, when the allegations came out by the now deceased former friend who made allegations against him. Now, there were calls at that time for an inquiry. Again, I would say largely fanned by the intense media attention. But the then Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, resisted calls for an inquiry. He kept saying, oh, he's entitled to the right to the presumption of innocence, and that, you know, how can there be an inquiry? There's no more evidence to come out. He can never go to trial. And he's, as he says, he's entitled to the presumption of innocence. And so eventually the calls for an inquiry seemed to die away, and it didn't happen. But again, that seems to have been, you know, there was the calls for the inquiry almost certainly derived out of media attention. And the things I'm going to touch on in my presentation, I think will be examples again of how certain matters get to the press. And I, again, don't say this critically, it's a fact of life, and I think it's great that there is, you know, attention drawn to these matters, but it seems to partly drive the legal steps that are taken in light of the media reporting.
Yeah, thanks for that. Those reflections. I think the Kathleen Folbig matter at University of Newcastle relates to the fact there's an innocence project
Yes.
at the law school at University of Newcastle, which is, as you explained, why some of that use of the media is as it is. And
I should say, I hasten to add, I don't say those things critically. I think that's great, because if there has been a miscarriage of justice, it needs to be corrected. So I'm all for transparency, shining a light, and I should also, I'll give one other example actually related to that. Perhaps there was a lady, Kelly Lane, who was convicted a few years ago for murdering her child. I don't know if you remember, she was the water polo player, and there was no body. She just couldn't account for one of the children that was that she gave birth to, if any people remember it. The only reason I mention it is I think her case has also been the subject of the Innocence Project, but the particular reason I mention it is she was represented by one of the people in my chambers, and I used to turn up at work in the morning, get out of the lift, and she'd be sitting there in our foyer every day of the trial, and we would exchange pleasantries, and she'd be off to, you know, being put on trial for the murder of her child. It was quite a surreal moment each morning as I got to work. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for those reflections. Final question. For our students at their stage of progress in their legal studies, many people changing careers, mature age law students as well. What advice would you give? Some wisdom, some tips about what to do now and how to think about transition into legal careers and the many legal careers one can have with legal qualifications?
Read. Read. And read reliable media sources, as opposed to spending time scrolling through your socials. I'd be reading, you know, the different media organizations from different walks of life, not necessarily reflecting your views, but also try to obtain views from different aspects. So and the New York Times, if you want an overseas perspective, I always think it's a good place to start. But I think, you know, reading is the key, and
Thanks,
reading and not just books,
yeah.
but media articles.
Thanks so much. I'm going to thank you for being part of our Industry Introductions podcast. And